Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to say my gratitude for the organizers of this conference to have invited me to give this lecture on God and the ambivalence of being. In fact, the origin of that conference was precisely the invitation given to me by the Institut Catholique of Paris to take over the new research chair entitled Dominique Dubarle, after the name of this great Dominican philosopher and theologian who was the chair of the Faculty of Philosophy of the Institut Catholique in the 80s. And the reason why this name, among other reasons, this name was chosen because of this following small anecdote. When Dominique Dubarle died, some of his friends decided, as an homage, to collect some of his paper under the title of God with being. And they asked me if I don't mind to have that book, God with Being, published some few years after God Without Being. And we have had some discussion with Dubarle, so indeed I agreed. And it was moving for me to be the first holder of the chair, Dominique Dubarle, that is between God without or with being, two possibilities. And it's why I was led to write on the relation between the two titles and the two postulations again. But this time I suddenly realized that there is two ways to ask the question of what it means to connect the question of being, Seinsfrage, with the question of God. You can do that in two different ways. Either you ask yourself, what are the consequences about God when you try to think God within the horizon of being? Or, what does happen to the question of God when you think the question of God within the question of being within the horizon of God? It is not the same thing to ask what God has to become when God is asked by being, or to ask the reverse question, what becomes being when it is seen from the point of view of God? And most of the time, when we connect the question of being with the question of God, it is, as we have an obvious testimony in the history of metaphysics, it is to, at the end, come down to the point where we try to build up an ontological access to God by, for instance, asking whether God has an essence or whether God has an existence. We try to understand God in terms of being. Could we be allowed and possibly required to do the exact reverse? Before trying to answer this question, we should first ask ourselves another question. The renewal of the Seinsfrage, the question of being, at the end of 19th century, after the downfall of neo-Kantism, through Husserl and mainly through Heidegger, was made on the rediscovery, according to Brentano, that in Aristotle, and not only in Aristotle, but in all the metaphysical tradition, there is a plurality of the meanings of being. So there is a Vielseitigkeit der Sinnen von Sein. And this was perfectly well explained in the breakthrough book of Brentano, very often referred to by Heidegger. So, when we ask ourselves about God, from the point of view of the question of being, we have to face the four different meanings of being, according to Aristotle. Energeia, dynamis, ousia, accident, truth, falsity, and categories. And this ambivalence of being is crucial, to the point, for instance, that Thomas Aquinas made this choice to select one of the four meanings of being, that is, being according to dynamis et energeia, to lead to God as actus essendi. Dropping, indeed, as according to Christian tradition, dropping the being according to the list of categories. So, and even to the meaning according to the ousia, because there is no ousia in God, because there is no accident. And indeed, truth and falsity apply to any being. So we have, if we want to ask questions about God from the point of view of being, we have to be aware that there is some choices to do. And this leads to the question, is there an ambiguity of being? And we should not, and I myself included, should not have said without being without a more precise definition of being. And those claiming that God should be identified to being have to explain first what they mean by being. So let us consider this preliminary question. If we persist in wanting to link God to being directly, ambiguities and imprecision arise and immediately accumulate like so many symptoms of the impropriety of the term being as such for God. Let us raise some of those improprieties. The first is the imprecision of knowing if the answer to the question of being can arise from a being among beings. What is being? If we answer God, God is being, being is God, do we not inadequately correlate some being or beings in general? Have we not, from the beginning, misunderstood the ontological difference, to speak like Heidegger? That we qualify this supreme being, summum ens entium, ens supremum, that we qualify God as supreme being only reinforces the inadequacy of the answer to the question by highlighting, by means of dealing with purely ontic transcendence, that we no longer understand being itself at all in the question, that we forget it in substituting an ontic response for an ontological question. What do we say about being when we answer to the question with the word God? Apparently, a being or nothing, something or nothing else. Hence, the first strikeout, so to speak, a being is substitute for being, capital B, attesting the ontological deficit of the answer God to the question of being. But conversely, what are we really saying about God when we reply to the question concerning God by being? What do we say divinely, so to speak, about God when we say, without further precision, further precaution, further ado, that God is? Everything in the world is. The human being, the animal, the vegetal, the stone, the star, the particles, the cells, even the God who died are, like the Grand Pan. And they were surely and without any doubt, for some people, absolutely real being, and perhaps some are still. So, what does it mean, the claim that the being who is teaches anything whatsoever about God in his divinity? Let us just comment on Exodus 3:14. When God says what was translated since the Septuagint as he who is, it is clear that from a biblical point of view, the first meaning of that answer is the denial of giving any name and any definition. So it is not completely inappropriate to have a positive understanding of our own, but it is not the first biblical meaning. So we could immediately understand that for the Bible, the name of God not only is not the name of an essence-giving definition, but is exactly the reverse, to the point that the name of God should not even be uttered. So, clearly, when we say that God is being, we say nothing divine about God, unless we establish the reverse, indeed. But we cannot take this for granted. So, the very strange situation is that when we answer the question of being by the word God, we don't say anything precise about being. And may I remind you of something you know. When we say about, as an answer to the question of God, being is God, we learn nothing about being. And I think that Heidegger is perfectly right to criticize this kind of answer. But we can say the exact reverse. When we answer to the question, who is God? We answer by being. Do we have any access to what make God God? That is, saint. Not only sacred, but saint. Clearly, if we mean that God exists, even in a prominent way, this is not enough to worship God. God may exist, and we may be allowed just to pay no attention to this existing God. And I would perhaps suggest that it is exactly the position of most of our contemporaries. The question is not whether God is or not, whether this God is divine. So the fact that God is not the final decision. The question is whether God is meaningful to us. That is, what is divine in God? Why should we pay attention to God? And if we just answer that God is because God exists or because God has the most perfect essence, this is a very inadequate answer. What does that mean to be divine? So the divinity of God is not completely secured by the being, existence, or essence of God. So those two questions appear deeply questionable themselves. Those two questions are perhaps not rightly or wrongly asked. They are not well constructed. Because whatever the answer may be, affirmative or negative, that makes no difference. So we have to face the ambiguity of the question of being when we ask that question about God. So let us perhaps pay more attention to what the question of being really means from an historical point of view. I would try to describe the main feature of the metaphysical understanding of being. By metaphysical understanding, I refer to, this precision is very important, to metaphysics, metaphysica, in historical and narrow meaning. That is, I consider that metaphysics starts with roughly Duns Scotus, who was the first to use metaphysics in the title of the book, Questiones Metaphysicae, and up to the last traditional use of metaphysics, that is, when criticized by Nietzsche or assumed by the generation of Cohen and the Marburg School in order to criticize it. That is the system of metaphysics as it is formally established by Suarez in the dialectic of the critique of pure reason, in the logic, in the social dialogic of Hegel, and so on. What in that case means being? Let us rely on Spinoza, who is very clear. Spinoza imposed the privilege of substance to the point that substance is, the is not only the determination of one among each being, of each being, in fact, in a more radical way, and I think is absolutely right to do so, there is only one possible substance. Why? Because the plurality of substance is at the end unbearable. Descartes explained plainly the problem. If the definition of the substance is what is subsistence per se, subsists by itself, only God subsists by itself. Every other alleged substance is just a substance by delegation. That is, provided that this is created by God, that this being is created by God and continue to be created at any moment, it can subsist by itself. But in fact, there is only, strictly speaking, one substance, that is God. And so Spinoza, very wisely, it's an oversimplification, but it is very wise and rational, has identified the three definitions of God. God is substantia per se, causa sui, and ens summe perfectum. First definition of Ethic 1. So there is one substance, and it is an absolute substance that is absolutely achieving what the substance is supposed to do. What the substance is supposed to do, it is supposed to stay. Substantia is supposed to stay. And Spinoza is so consequent and radical that he, in Ethics 3, book 3, section 6, he gives the definition, I would say the operative definition of the substance. It is anything insofar as it is in se, in its own power, in sua esse perseverare conatur, makes any possible effort to persevere in sua esse. To be is to be by itself without external support. And to be by itself without external support means simply to keep being, to stay as long as we can. And this, let us point that out, give a very strong confirmation to a statement made by Heidegger, who has never spoken roughly of Spinoza. Heidegger saying that for the Greeks, the ousia is always connected to the parousia. That is, there is what we call a substance or an essence, means always presence. And to be an ousia is to possess the presence and keep it as long as you can. And the best Greek, in that case, is Spinoza. Because to be is to be a substance, and to be a substance is to make any possible effort to keep remaining in the presence. That is the conatus in sua esse perseverare. So, to sum it up, to be, according to metaphysics, is to stay in presence, and to possess the presence. Briefly, because it's not the core of my argument, we can see that again in the rehearsed definition of the category of substance by Kant, where Kant says that the characteristic of the substance, it's why it's so difficult to reach a substance without sensitive intuition, is the fact to stay, to persist. In the German of Kant, that is beharren, the Beharrlichkeit, the endurance, so to speak, the fact to stay permanently in the presence. This is the characteristic of being privileged by metaphysics. But there is, in this deep connection between presence and being as ousia substantia, there is from the end, Nietzsche, to the beginning, Aristotle, an obvious failure. This obvious failure was described by, let us start by Aristotle. When Aristotle discussing in physics for the definition of time, insists on the fact that if we admit that time is about subsisting and persisting in this presence, clearly time is not always present. Time is not exactly reducible to presence. The past does not exist anymore, the future does not exist yet, only the present does exist in the present. Our experience is that the present is limited to the present. So far, so good. But the present itself, the parousia, and this has been exploited and explained with a terrible efficacy by Augustine in Confessiones, book 11, section 15 and 14. The present itself does not last. How long does the present, by opposition to the past and the future, last? A year? No. A month? No. A week? No. A day? No. So you go down to the V-second, but the V-second, as we know, is too long. And in the Olympic Games, it is far more tiny than V-second. It is a million of a second in ski. Million of a second. So the present itself is present only on the tickle of the instant, to noon. But to noon, which is the only present, which is in the presence, has as a consequence this particularity that it does not last. So the paradox of metaphysical definition of being by presence is that being and nothingness are the same. And it is absurd, but it is unavoidable. So this analysis, which I have summed up in, too quickly indeed, is the same from Aristotle, explained by Augustine, up to Nietzsche, saying, against Kant, that Beharrlichkeit is always flying away. We cannot grasp any Beharrlichkeit. Our experience of being is that being is in transformation, not in Beharrlichkeit. And Bergson will say that, everyone will say that. So, the metaphysical determination of being as ousia, the ousia in strongest meaning by perseverance in parousia, leads to that contradiction. And I don't know any exception to that contradiction. Even Heidegger, or the last example is Husserl. All the experience of time is made possible by the fact that we keep in the first memory the next past, and that we anticipate on the next future. Time as present is only the Ur-impression, and the Ur-impression has to be renewed at any instant because it does not last. So the Ur-impression, which is the only real source of being, not only does not last, but strictly speaking is not yet a being. So we have an experience of presence because we product by memory and by anticipation a lasting present, which is never given to us by the Ur-impression. So, the determination of being by itself has two characteristics. The first is that it is self-contradictory, unless further development which I'm not aware of, and cannot be used to describe God. we have to use a negative concept, the concept of eternity, which is in fact of no use for two reasons. We have no experience and no definition of eternity. So we say eternity, which is a way to say we don't know. And secondly, eternity in this abstract and arbitrary meaning, far from allowing us to understand the revelation of God, is rather a deep obstacle to a good theology, because the opposition between time and eternity as such makes impossible to understand eschatology, makes the question of creation very much more difficult, and so on. So the answer by eternity is at best another way to explain the aporia. So this leads to me to my first and provisory conclusion, which is that the question of being cannot help us to answer the question of God. But I would try to use some more time to follow the reverse hypothesis. Is it possible to consider the question of being from the point of view of God? Let us make two steps in that direction. The first will be philosophical, and I shall follow an argument by Heidegger, and the second will be biblical. The aporia of the presence of being, as reduced to the possession of presence, comes to us from metaphysical thought. That is, metaphysica in a strict historical meaning. But it appears crucial only to a non-metaphysical consideration of philosophy. I mean, even in philosophy, we could have asked, and perhaps we should ask, the question of being in another way than in the most restricted meaning of being, that is, subsisting presence. This attempt was at least receive at least a first sketch in a very famous text of Heidegger, The Words of Anaximander. Let me remind you the result of this very famous text. Anaximander, which is supposed to be the first philosopher who has left some lines actually written, is known for this sentence. I quote, "For beings, wherever genesis is from, it is from the same things that destruction is born according to necessity." I'll keep going. "Beings do each other justice and reparation for their mutual injustice according to the allocation of time." The beings do to each of themselves, between themselves, justice and injustice according to how they give and take time. So what is this justice and injustice? Dike aditya, according to the distribution of time. What does that sound? What does that mean? That the beings could be just or unjust one to each other. Obviously, because a being manifests itself and makes itself seen in presence by entering in presence and occupying it, and because this occupation of presence, part of presence, by each being, implies that in persevering in its being, we can understand that each being occupying presence does this occupation against other beings. Let us keep in mind the formulation of Pascal. There is only one spot under the sun. And if I do occupy this spot, it cannot be occupied by another. There is many comments on Levinas about that. This is in fact a question of property. When you say, this is mine, this is the first step for property, and this is an injustice, because you forbid any other to do the same. So, there may be justice or injustice between beings according to presence. So Heidegger insists on that. It is a powerful way, if this is the most, the earliest possible text in the history of Western philosophy, that this is yet describing the last moment of metaphysics with Nietzsche. Because the answer of Nietzsche to this is the eternal return. The eternal return giving justice to all beings. All beings are allowed to be in their turn. So the metaphysical answer to the injustice explained by Anaximander is the eternal return. This is an additional remark. So Heidegger insists on the fact that what Anaximander points out leads us to the core of the aporia, metaphysical aporia of presence, which is that is to be present. This is the contradiction between, because the presence don't even last in the present, and there is an injustice of the present. So, what should be seen? Again, Heidegger comments, and commenting Anaximander again, by saying the presence remains ambiguous, das Anwesende bleibt zweideutig. Why the presence, Anwesenheit, looks double, ambiguous. Answer. Because according to metaphysics, presence means the present, radically understood. That is, the instant, to nun, to nunc. The nunc, the nun, the now, the pure now. But a non-unjust approach to the presence. Non-unjust because it would not exclude from presence all the Anwesenheit. That is, all the beings would be, Heidegger says, commenting Anaximander, I have no time to detail the analysis, would mean that to admit that presence extend broader than present. That in fact in presence, and this is exactly what Husserl used to suggest, that presence, Anwesenheit, implies past and future as well as the strictly speaking present, which in fact is self-destroying. That is, to make justice to the presence, we should include within the presence the double Abwesenheit, that is, the double absence. In other words, the absence should be taken as a part of the presence. That is, the presence which is not yet reduced to the present. Is it possible to admit a presence not reduced to the present? How could the presence include the double absence of the past and the future? To this question, Heidegger gives no answer. It is, this should be done. And to some extent, Husserl, by the doctrine of retention, and Nietzsche, by the doctrine of the eternal return, aimed to that extension of the presence beyond the limits in the grasp of the present. But now, what does that mean? That something could be in the presence without being reduced to the present, that is to say, to the possession of present. Because the present, strictly speaking, is a question of possession. To explain this, we have other phenomenological resources. In my language, the two questions, that of the gift and that of the event, which, at least it is my point, which are a case of presence including this double absence. But the core of the question is precisely what makes the present contradictory. Why is the present always reduced to the self-destroying present of the instant? Because the presence of the instant is always own. You can own only one instant. And so the instant, insofar as it is possessed, is injured, to speak like an axiom. So the idea that the spot of the present could be occupied by the past and the future, as well as by the present, and not only by the present, this is a question of suspending the possession of the instant, of considering that the present is not a way to possess the present. What does that mean, not to possess present? Theologically speaking, this has a precise meaning. Philippian letter of Paul to the Philippians chapter 3, verse 6. Uparkon en morphe tuteu, uk arpagmon, that is the Greek, he did not consider, what was the
quality.
in Greek.
Ison theory.
No, the verb. He did not, well, anyway, he did not consider to is egesato. Voilà, thank you. Uk arpagmon egesato to iso to theo einai. He did not consider egesato, excuse me, as something to be possessed, arpagmon. The fact to be equal to God. To be, to einai. There are very few use in the Bible, in the New Testament, of the infinitive to einai. It is not taionta, as we find sometimes there are some few cases in Paul. Here it is the infinitive, to einai. It is not being, it is to be. So Christ was in a situation, an ontological situation. He has the same to be, to einai, than God, equal to God. And this formulation, incidentally, has a confirmation, because in John, Gospel according to John 5:18, the Jews accuse Jesus to claim to be ison toteo, equal to God. So, Paul here has the same language, and even more radical than that of the narrative kept by John. So the question is to be equal to God, to have the to be of God. So it is even more radical than the I am in John 8 and 12, because it is the to be itself. It is, let's say, the actus essendi, to some extent. It is already the act of to be. So what is surprising here is that the to be equal to the Father, equal to God, equal to the Father, is used in such a way, and we don't know whether it was a liturgical hymn quoted by Paul or a text by Paul. That ambiguity gives to the text an even greater authority. What is strange here is that the question to be equal to God is expressed as a matter of possession, as in Anaximander. This arpagmon, adikia, dike. So, Christ is the one for whom it is not unfair, it is just to stay in the presence as God. And it would have been just that only God could enjoy presence. Where were you when I created the world? No right to ask for anything, because you are coming from nothing. So, only for God it is fair, dikaios, to consider to be as his possession. So the question is, what does God do with that privilege indeed into me? What does and accomplishes up to the end God in that situation? Up to the end, ex Theophilus, John 13:1. Having loved his disciples, he loved them to the end. Ex telos. May I emphasize that ex telos could be translated in Aristotle, in the language of Aristotle. This is the entelecheia. The entelecheia of loving. What does that mean, the entelecheia of loving? This question of the entelecheia of loving in Gospel according to John is revived because John he loved his disciples ex telos, the beginning of the story of the Passion. The very end of the story of the Passion in John 19:30 is everything is accomplished, tetelestai. So it's about the entelecheia of agape. So, what is about the entelecheia of agape? This entelecheia of agape can be expressed, if we compare John Paul, as dealing with the to be equal to God. So, when God when Christ achieves the agape, that is, reaches the entelecheia of the agape, what is he doing as a consequence toward his privilege, iso to theo einai? Precisely, not to possess it anymore. The way of being achieved by Christ as a consequence of the achievement of the agape led to the telos is precisely not to possess being. For a metaphysical mind and a metaphysical being, to be and to go to the telos of to be is to possess being as long as you can. What is proper to the being in which God has taken a body and a soul, the created being, and there is no other than created, when God decides to be as we do, he does not be, if I can say so, the same way that we do. For us to be is to possess our being, because we are born Spinozist. And in the case of the way of being of God, when you are insofar as you are in agape, it is a reverse situation. Being is not something to be possessed. And this suspension of the possession of being is, in fact, the evangelical way of considering the Seinsfrage, which is a non-metaphysical one. So one of the texts I refer to very willingly is indeed the parable of the prodigal son. Just to sum it up, the parable of the prodigal son is the only text of the New Testament using the word ousia. And ousia is taken not in the technical meaning of Aristotle, but in the original meaning, which is well known by Aristotle and Plato, that is, when you possess, in fact, it is a real estate. When you possess some land or the a mansion on this land, that is real estate, that is usia. And it's why the son claims to have his part of inheritance, and the father has to sell part of his being, of his usia. And you can, because the son wants to possess it, and to go away, and to spend it his way. And it is illegal, and the father has to do that. And the father did. The point is that this transforming into money the good, the real estate, can be interpreted that the usia is what you possess. And you can waste your usia because you possess it. So the deperdition of the usia is made possible by the presupposition that the usia is our possession. And de facto, in metaphysics, it is because we possess the usia that we have to keep it in the presence and to resist the dispersion of the usia. This is exactly the story of the prodigal son. So I stop the comment here. So the question of the usia is whether we possess it or not. And it is very clear that the role of the father in this parable is to convince, in fact, the older son as well as his younger son, because the younger son has at least understood that to have claimed to possess the usia was a very bad idea. So he wants not to be again the son, but at least to be paid minimum wage, 14 bucks an hour. I support. But make no mistake, the older son is in a worse situation because the older son is convinced that he is much more fair to his father because he never claimed to possess. But now that the first son has possessed, now he claims to possess because it is his right. And the father has to explain to the older son that he is a son. And you know, in the text, it's very nicely written, because there is two words in Greek to say son. Can be yos, and the other is teknon. Yeah. And so when you think legally, it is yos. So when there is a heritage and mentally, it is to the younger yos. But to the older son, it is teknon. Teknon. He said, teknon, you guy. It's a father-son relationship with teknon. So well seen. So he has to explain to him what. I read what he says. He says, everything which is mine is yours. That's the final word of the father to the son. But everything which is mine is yours is exactly what Christ says in John in the final prayer to the Father. Everything which is yours is mine. So the real answer to the parable is a re-establishment of the logic of the Passion of Christ between the Son and the Father. What, from an ontological point of view, what is the meaning of the Passion and Resurrection? It is by non-possessing your being that you get it. It is not by possessing it. So there is many other reflection to be done on that point. But let me connect this with two formulations given by, used by Paul. When Paul says that in 1 Corinthians and Romans 4, that God has chosen ta meonta in order to make to have confused taonta. God is using, and this is ontological language again, non-beings in order to disqualify beings. And in Roman, God has called the non-beings, ukonta, into beings. That is, God is disobeys the laws of ontology. Laws of ontology, ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing can be at the same moment different from itself. God is not submitted to the principle of identity. So we have to consider that creation, which after all is repeated in resurrection, has ontological implication, not only ontical implication. It is not only God is very powerful and he can do everything, but he can contradict the rules of being. The rule of being is that the thing should remain identical to itself. It's why a thing should persist in possessing his doing. And not only God can do something from nothing and always disqualify the self-proclaimed self-sufficiency of the beings by producing non-beings instead of beings. Because God is not disqualifying beings by destroying beings. He's disqualifying beings by making non-beings exist against the principle of identity. So it is an ontological and not only ontical disqualification. This ontological disqualification is based not on the fact that God has anything against identity. God has a great opposition, not to identity, but to what for us is implied by identity, that is possession. Being should not be possessed. So what may be, according to in Philippians, what should be the right way to use our being? It is that we should not possess our being, expressed as a principle in the Gospels, and this is in common in all the synoptics. Whoever seeks his soul will lose it, and whoever will lose it for the love of me will keep it. Be careful. It is not you win when you lose, and you lose when you win. It is not only that. It is for the love of Christ. So it's according to the logic of love that this inversion can be achieved. It's because we get out of the logic of identity as possession and reach the logic of dispossession as agape. What would be an identity without possession and according to agape? It is the circulation, the dispossession, and what is the asset of dispossession? What is better in the dispossession than in possession, after all? If you possess your soul, that is your to be, you cannot receive it anymore. And you are away from the Father. You are by yourself. And you cannot give it back because you have known to give it back. So the question of possession is not that God denies the self-sufficiency and the security, is that the self-sufficiency and security cannot be achieved by possession, as only a Trinitarian meaning. That is, it is because you give back your to einai to God that you can receive it from God, which is exactly the death and resurrection of Christ. And what is the advantage of this way on and back? That the gift is alive, and that the identity is achieved indeed, ex telos, tetelestai, but is achieved within communion. That is, the unity is based on the union, and not on the self-identity by possession. So, Trinity is key. There is a Trinitarian understanding of the being of God. I have to say it is a bit polemical, not the way according to which Emerle or Hegel or Schelling have done it, because they explain all of them. Trinity through being. No, you have to explain being through Trinity. Being is anaporia. I don't understand why so many theologians imagine that being will save theology. No, it is really a stone attached to the neck of the theologian. Because philosophers themselves are really in deep trouble for any definition of being. If you add the indefinition of being to the indescriptibility of God, read about the difficulty. So, being cannot be the explanans. It is the explanandum. And being could perhaps be understood from the point of view of charity. I was absolutely not aware of that when I wrote God Without Being. It's why God Without Being is not a self-standing book. And it is always a bit in disequilibrium. I know that. So, but I was not aware, or I was not bold enough to have the insight into this, I understand, strange proposition that we can ask and think in another way the Seinsfrage, not only by coming back to Alexander, Parmenides, Aristotle, Hölderlin, or others, but that we have to take seriously from a theoretical point of view the biblical text. And it is very surprising that In fact, theologians have completely agreed that there is no theory in the biblical text. At least, if you read that in Greek, there are some technical, philosophical words. You can deny and say, well, they have no philosophical meaning. But you have to demonstrate that first. Because you can read them as if. And after all, the as if is a bit difficult because there are not many indications, but it makes sense. As long as it will make sense, I shall keep trying. Thank you very much.
Professor Marion said it's hard to possess time, but time can possess us, and time presses very hard on us. His delivery of the paper has the character of an event. In other words, there was a great deal that was done all'improviso compared to the text that I have, so I will similarly respond very briefly in one or two points to Professor Marion. And then we can resume our conversation over supper, which will be 2 blocks that way at the top of the Corboy Law Center at 25 East Pearson in Casbeer Hall. Before I make my remarks, I want to say thank you very much to 2 people in particular. Kathleen McNutt, who translated Professor Marion's original French essay masterfully, and Bettina Bergo, who assisted me in revising it and who can't be here today because a friend of hers has a health emergency and she is taking care of her, which I deeply admire. Very, very briefly, there's much to agree with. Amicus Marion said magis amica veritas. There's much to agree with in Professor Marion's paper. And his reversal of the question of considering being from the not considering God from the standpoint of the question of being, but rather being from the standpoint of God. I think what I would invite him and I would invite us to think about is how to extend that in certain ways. One of the names that has not been mentioned very much at this conference has been Gianni Vattimo. And Vattimo's approach to weak thought, to weak ontology, supplemented by Professor Caputo's notions of weak theology, and also that he works Vattimo into his own thinking, suggests to us that the problems of thinking of being and thinking of God are inextricably entangled and interwoven. If, however, as Heidegger tells us, that nihilism is something that befalls being, out of the very essence of being, and that, therefore, as Heidegger himself says, that nothing is happening to be, then, therefore, we have to take seriously the possibility that there's an entanglement there between philosophical thinking and theological thinking, so that we must approach the problem of thinking about God in the direction of being, without dissociating it from the other direction, that is to say, thinking about being from the direction of God. Which means that we have not only a weak ontology, but a weak theology. Or as Vattimo would put it, a kind of drift, a deriva, which drifts in its limit to caritas, which is where Professor Marion ends, with the notion of love. There's a kind of limit to hermeneutic drift for Vattimo. It's open-ended, it's nothing that ends. We open ourselves to a theological and a philosophical future which cannot be closed off, which involves endless invention, endless reinvention, and an endless hermeneutic with the tradition, but one in which the tradition is always added onto. That there's a possibility of unlimited continued growth and no final position in either philosophy or theology. And that's how I read Professor Marion's Trinitarian approach, because the Trinitarian approach depends, in its essence, upon a notion of event. Event always seems to involve the absolutely surprising, the absolutely novel. Claude Romano makes a very great deal of this in, I think, section 14 of Event in Time. To surprise means not, I mean, the old meanings of the word surprise are mostly military. It means to attack, to overtake, rather to take over, and to occupy, possess. But that can't really be the central meaning of surprise, because after all, as Professor Marion has demonstrated, the notion of a persisting, insistent occupation of the present is central to the Spinozist notion. So it's not a replacement for the Spinozist. But what's more important in the notion of surprise is not taking over, but overtaking. As when you come up behind someone who doesn't see you, and they're looking in every other direction but you, and you tap them on the shoulder. Okay? They jump. Right? Surprise means endless novelty, infinite hermeneutic possibilities. And so it seems to me that one of the most concrete ways of thinking about the Trinitarian idea is through this notion of infinite hermeneutic. Last remark. I have a problem, and it's one of my most, I think, a bone of contention that I have with Professor Marion. It seems to me that, and he concluded his talk by talking about for the love of me, for the love of Christ. It seems to me that what's missing here is something like Levinas's notion of eleity. You remember that Levinas speaks in essays and in Otherwise Than Being about a dimension of the divine, which he calls eleity, which is the tendency, is the inability on our part, when we regard the trace of God, to come into any kind of direct contact with God. And Levinas uses the example of Hebrew blessings. You begin the blessing, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, in the second person. And then by the end of the verse, you're in the third person. In other words, God, as it were, does not permit a direct address, a direct encounter. And it seems to me that seems to be the meaning of Christ's paradigmatic prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. The admirabile commercium of Christ's will and God the Father's will means that we really, it is not our job and not our mission in some sense to be related in a primary way to Christ, but it is to be related to the other advenant, the other adonné, the other
May
gift.
I disagree?
Go ahead.